some of you know me, and those of you who don't yet, fortunately, my name's Tom Haakenson. You're going to hear more about me at the next panel when I present. But I'm in the Bay Area of San Francisco and Oakland, California, at the California College of the Arts, where I'm an associate professor here. I actually live in Sacramento, which is jokingly referred to by my students as a suburb of San Francisco. So I'm in Sacramento. My students refer to it as a suburb of San Francisco, but it's actually the capital of California. So I'm really honored to be able to introduce our three panelists today and this panel on Decentering across media. And I think you're in for a real treat, a fantastic triumvirate of presenters. And what I'll do is I'll start by introducing our first speaker, and then when our first speaker is finished, I'll return and introduce our next speaker and so forth. And then I think pro forma, as we have been doing, questions will be reserved for the end of the three presentations, and then we'll have more of an open discussion. So our first presenter is Sara Hall. Some of you may know Sara quite well. She's Associate Professor of Germanic Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she directs the Moving Image Arts minor. She is the co-author of a Mellon Grant that funds the University of Illinois, Chicago's Engaged Humanities Initiative. And she's directed at democratizing undergraduate humanities pedagogy and the future of research in the humanities. Her work on Weimar cinema and transnational screen cultures has been published, and the excellent work that she does has been published in venues such as German Studies Review, Modernism, Modernity, and the Historical Journal of Radio, Film, and Television. Her paper today extends from her work on a book titled Police Exhibition, Weimar Cinema and Law Enforcement Culture in Berlin, 1918-1931. And I'm very much excited to hear Sara's talk, and I just need to give her a shout out as well. She's our incoming German Studies Association Vice President. So Sara, I'll leave it to you to talk about Decentering Weimar Cinema, locating the Kulturfilm across consumerism, citizenship, and spectatorship.
Okay, so I will start my slideshow here. All right, thank you again, Irvin and Nicole, for bringing us all together, and Tom for moderating this panel. It's been really a thought-provoking process for me to prepare this paper, and I'm grateful to have this framework to have jarred me a little bit out of some of the ways I was thinking about the work that I'm doing. So with the time I have today, I would like to explore the possibilities and limits of decentering the study of German cinema through a radical temporal and spatial deepening undertaken in search of text types and exhibition contexts that have generally been understudied, especially in our work on the 1920s. As my title indicates, I'm particularly interested in the nonfiction and hybrid form of sort of Gattung, as opposed to genre, that belongs to the broadly conceived textual category of the Kulturfilm. The Kulturfilm exemplify what Gregory Waller has called, in the context of US film history, a multi-sided cinema by virtue of the diversity of their programming settings in schools, in laboratories, in industrial training centers, and also in urban exhibitions. So I'm coming to my line of inquiry today through my work on a very specific case study that is set in the mid-1920s, namely the exhibition of educational and public relations films at law enforcement trade shows, such as those held in Sopot in 1924, in Karlsruhe in 1925, and Berlin in 1926, as well as at the Traffic and Transport Exposition in Munich in 1925. Being so institutionally, topographically, and temporally specific, my project epitomizes what those working in the mode of the new cinema history would call a microhistory, albeit one that I would argue has wide-reaching implications for our understanding of Weimar modernity. On the occasion of this conference, I'm especially interested in exploring the usefulness of the Gebrauchsfilm, or the useful film, as an entry in a decentered history of German cinema. In the hypothesis stage of this research, I anticipated arguing that the history of the subculture of the Weimar Kulturfilm was distinct from a historiography centered on narrative feature films shown in commercial cinemas, which we generally approach in this sort of sweet spot of discussion between authorship, spectatorship, and nation, most of which we frame diachronically. So this is, I was looking to distinguish the culture of the Kulturfilm from what we conventionally think of and work on as Weimar cinema. But my research, so let's see. So my research actually ended up uncovering more overlaps and imbrications than I had originally anticipated. As this research has deepened, I've uncovered more institutional, financial, and personnel sharing between the feature film industry and the Kulturfilm industry as it was tapped into by the police in the Weimar Republic. The history of films generated by entities that might at first appear to lie far afield from an UFA or an America or a Deutlich. So you'll see that in the case of the feature film, we've got the two major studios that dominated feature film production, who also dominated cultural film production. And I'm happy to talk about how I came up with these Venn diagrams in the discussion, since you obviously won't have time to look at them in great detail. So the history of the films that are coming from a space that you would think would be outside of an UFA, an America, or a Deutlich turns out to be the story of production resources, personnel, and money shared with the commercial film industry, of mutually beneficial programming and marketing frameworks, and an equal investment in a model of spectatorship at the intersection of commercial consumption and participatory citizenship. The fact that the most visible and well-attended screenings of police films took place at trade shows with a merchandising orientation is a case in point of the kind of imbricated spectatorship and consumption that I'm interested in, and the dynamic of media convergence that Sabine Hake highlighted yesterday. I would posit that a detailed analysis of this imbrication with an emphasis on both industry and audience studies can reveal the pressure points and strains put on a common Medienverbund, or a network of alliances of independent, competing, and complementary media practices in which both the police and mainstream movie culture operated. There were also pressures put on attempts at the production of a dispositif, or a viewing framework that situated audience members not just as consumers or subjects of entertainment, but also as engaged and active participants in a contested public sphere. What is more, close textual analysis of the rare existing films, and some do exist, there were hundreds of films made by the police, and there are actually a couple that are available now on DVD. So close textual analysis of these films can reveal openings for engaged and critical modes of spectatorship and audience behaviors that exceeded and challenged the concepts of perception, cognition, affect, sociability, and impact that were assumed and imposed by those in positions of cultural and state authority. I have found myself somewhat akin to what Sabine Hake articulated yesterday. I found myself wondering about the degree to which a decentering of German cinema depends upon deterritorialization. Is it possible to decenter German cinema in work that is squarely centered within the geographic boundaries of the nation state? This conundrum has become all the more vexing as my presumably generically and spatially decentered research continues to turn up the deep roots of corporatist, nationalist, bourgeois-oriented impulses, even in films that do not fit squarely within Weimar cinema studies, as we have been pursuing them for decades. What vocabulary, research, and textual analytical methodologies are available to those of us working in an archival mode so that we can avoid being perpetually thrust back into a conventional center as a result of being at the mercy of our sources, no matter how ephemeral or peripheral those sources may be. And in this case, many of my sources come from municipal state archives and police records, as opposed to from film archives, where I was used to doing all my research. So I offer this as an example of the challenge that the case of the embeddedness of the history of the Kulturfilm in the history of UFA and its dedicated Kulturfilm Abteilung. So I offer as an example of this challenge the case of the embeddedness of the history of the Kulturfilm in the history of UFA and its dedicated Kulturfilm Abteilung. So this department within UFA was by no means the only site of Kulturfilm production, but it certainly was the best resourced and the most famous. There are overlapping discourses of Kulturfilm production and reception, especially in the case of UFA, and wider reaching concerns about Germany's status as a Kulturland or Kulturnation in the aftermath of World War I. As descendants of the Kinoreformbewegung, the individuals that I'm studying in the archives turn to film to rehabilitate the image of the state locally and abroad, and to assimilate post-war German policing into a global community of Kulturnationen, which is a term that they invoke repeatedly as if it were an internationally agreed upon standard, while they also continually apply longstanding German bourgeois notions of the confluence of education, taste, behavior, and national belonging. So a little bit of that history. The UFA Kulturfilm Abteilung benefited enormously in 1926. It was already well established as the inheritor of the propaganda mission that informed the original founding of UFA, but it benefited enormously from the establishment of the 1926 entertainment tax law. Cinema owners who included Kulturfilme that had received an official seal of value from the Central Institute for Education and Instruction would see their admissions tax reduced. This concession not only helped generate rentals of Kulturfilme, it also rewarded vertical integration. An UFA-owned cinema could guarantee bookings of UFA-made films in the accompanying material and the main feature of their programs, thus garnering for UFA the profits from ticket sales and the tax rebate. This law also had the effect of creating even more slippage in the vernacular between the term Lehrfilm and Kulturfilm, which are used somewhat interchangeably in the discourse, but once UFA gets kind of its hands on that term Kulturfilm, a lot more things are assumed to be UFA products or projects that should fall under UFA's purview. So this made UFA the go-to partner for the Berlin police when they wanted to make films that would make a big impression in various settings, including the Orania Adult Education Center and the police exhibitions that were cropping up mid-decade. So as the case of the tax law indicates, state authority and big capital intertwined in UFA's business model, converging to promote a mutually beneficial construct of Kultur. The work of the studio thus resonated strongly with Reichskanzler Wilhelm Marx's morally inflected preface to a 1924 publication by the film industry called Das Kulturfilmbuch, where he praised the film industry for weathering the challenges of the war and post-war years, which he refers to in German as die Abschnürung Deutschlands. And he wrote, quote, this is my rough translation into English for the time being. It is culture that creates the most intimate connections between intellectual and economic interests, elements. In my opinion, the cultural film can only be created through this connection. All the achievements to date will provide incentive for further success. And in light of the great importance of film for the education of the German people, I wish success to all those making efforts in this direction. There will certainly be no lack of state support when it is necessary and where it is possible. The fact that all 12 of UFA's releases in 1926, for example, received the seal of value, so the tax would get the tax break, while only 4 from other companies did receive this seal of value. This testifies to the prominent place and high regard of this particular studio as propagator of art, culture, and education in the arenas of feature and education films and the places where they converged. The participation of the studio as one of the main partners of the police film project mutually benefited the studio and the police, who wanted to underscore the public and educational qualities of their work in order to pass what Klaus Kreimeier has called the test of culture, or the kulturelle Klausur. So this history has left me questioning my original hypothesis. Can a deeply archival, intermedial, and interdisciplinary approach to film history that moves attention away from the narrative feature film contribute to a decentering of German cinema studies? And if so, how and by what means, if the case study is centered in the capital city? How do we ferret out the experiences of audiences that our sources seem to be working hard to assimilate, silence, or make invisible? And how do we do so without inadvertently reassimilating their history and the history of their experiences into the mainstream, and thus pulling them into a pre-existing normative center? So interestingly, the majority of the studies of German texts or German audience case studies that I have found helpful in articulating my approach to this particular phenomenon have been published in volumes that did not necessarily take a national cinema approach and are not necessarily invested in a national cinema model. And I've put a few of those up on the screen here. So like Michael Cowan's study of advertising and exhibition films, there is a considerable overlap with police film culture, my approach to the Kulturfilm corpus extends from the model of what Thomas Elsässer theorized as film history as media archaeology. One could argue that studying police records, police films, and exhibition planning documents that were likely not anticipated as objects of extended interpretation, let alone 100 years of collection and preservation, successfully decenters the traditional Weimar canon with its critical and scholarly focus on authorship and movement. It calls us to bring these films that have been standing on the sidelines into the center or under the microscope, whatever metaphor we want to use, and that we elucidate them through what Elsässer has called in German the 3 A's: Auftrag, Anlass, and Adressat. So commission, context, and constituency. And I'd like to thank Ali Field for the translation of those 3 C's to go with the 3 A's. And while some have said that this approach means relinquishing aesthetic or auteurist concerns, in my analysis of the Weimar police film, a 4th A of auteur does enter the picture, albeit in a radically different manner than the sense fostered by auteur theory, namely as a label to be bestowed not only on great directors producing stylistically marked bodies of work, but also on those who were, quote, pioneering in extending the uses and applications of the cinematic apparatus, end quote, who participated in the production of a distinct film corpus. Writing what Elsässer has proposed as not just, quote, cinema and film history, but also cinema and film in history, end quote, requires foregrounding a different set of agents than previous histories of Weimar cinema. So for example, in Scott Curtis's case, scientists and teachers, and in the case of my study, the police and their political, commercial, and technical collaborators. So in keeping with Elsässer's model, and also the work that Michael Cowan has done, a 5th A of Archiv is also significant, for it is there that knowledge about technology, industry, temporal and spatial arrangements, and audiences of the past can be discovered. Thematizing the archive and studying the history of cinema on the basis of sometimes disparate and fragmentary historical evidence, which is akin to ruins, relics, and remains, of course, invites the analogy of an overarching 6th A, which is Archäologie, archaeology, and by extension, media archaeology as a methodological supplement to and revision of classical film methodology. And it also distinct in the way that I'm approaching this topic from the media archaeology model as articulated by Elsässer and others. In my case study, I do work counter to those and new cinema history by also arguing that a 7th A of aesthetic must stay in the proverbial picture, for it is there in the aesthetics that some aspects of the experience of spectatorship can be speculatively but productively explored. And it is there that industry and institutional fantasies about spectatorship are documented for us to consider. The police spokespersons, filmmakers, and record keepers who generated the texts that I study engaged more than you might expect with film form, and they addressed, sometimes at length, the representational qualities that they found more and less productive for various aspects of their work. These formal concerns do constitute an important facet of a particular slice of the public sphere within Weimar's highly technologized, mass media saturated, popular culture obsessed young democracy. They constituted part of what Corinna Müller and Harro Segeberg have theorized as a Kinoöffentlichkeit. So on the one side of this campaign to police through film, as I call it loosely, stood a state institution undergoing a transformation in the wake of war and political upheaval, intent upon setting new images of itself in circulation, mostly in the name of self-preservation. In this context, police representatives made themselves audible and visible among the interest groups that included scientists, educators, advertisers, and politicians, who've been documented not only as debating cinema's cultural significance and sway, but also as eventually recognizing and even embracing its force as a problem-solving tool. But most of this documentation applies to film before 1918. So in that context, various professions drew on strategies from other cultural spheres to serve their own political and institutional needs, thus mobilizing the moving image's capacity not only to entertain, but also to transform experimental processes, refine and improve upon direct observation, and record and disseminate new knowledge within expert circles and on to a wider public. So on the other side of this equation, in the Weimar setting, were cinema audiences consuming these images who did not always fall in line with an institutional agenda and its media tactics. In pursuit of the under-researched cinematic world of the Weimar police, I have come across not only what the police intended and what they did and did not accomplish, but also some of the print texts that provide evidence of a critical spectatorial stance, especially from the left. So I'm working in the archive on artifacts that include essays, poetry, caricatures, and repurposed imagery that show the negotiation and contestation that took place in cinemas, lecture halls, and exhibition complexes, processes that cannot be accounted for entirely by models of docile spectatorship and manipulated cultural consumption that are informed only by Gramscian models of hegemony, Frankfurt School paradigms of homogenization and manipulation by the culture industry, Foucauldian models of panopticism, or apparatus theory with its emphasis on the ways that technology manipulates the individual psyche. Taking stock of both the production and reception and critical side of this equation, I want to look to these kinds of responsive sources for how they underscore the importance of thinking dialogically and dialectically about the relationship between state agencies and moving image culture, and the attempts by state agencies to establish a paradigm that attempted to exert authority and preserve certain existing and social political structures, while also perhaps inadvertently manifesting texts that display mass culture's pluralism and that activate some of its democratizing, even liberatory potential to dismantle exactly that paradigm set by the police. So just to wrap up, the history of the life of the Kulturfilm within police history serves as a reminder that while ordinary people were the target of the mass cultural agenda of state agencies such as law enforcement, they were also the co-producers and the critics of not just the consumers or victims of film and its surrounding culture in that context and beyond. I want to underscore the argument that despite the movement towards industry consolidation represented by the increased standardization on the international marketplace, as well as what we know with 2020 hindsight about the central role of entertainment, propaganda, and documentary films, forms that blended together in Nazi processes of cultural coordination or Gleichschaltung, that despite previous emphasis on the mobilization of mass culture and the politicization and militarization of everyday life, even state-sponsored films in the years before the Nazi takeover displayed heterogeneous aesthetics and a plurality of experiences. And I'm happy to talk about those details in the Q&A. The Prussian police based in Berlin generated a vision of cinema culture where identities and constituencies converged and conflicted, where community and solidarity were both encouraged and undermined. Even in the hands of state authorities in the 1920s, cinema remained a site of possibility where, in Miriam Hansen's words, quote, social experience is articulated, interpreted, negotiated, and contested in an intersubjective, potentially collective, and oppositional form, end quote. I've been interested in looking to provide a history that looks very different than the one that is being used in Bertelsmann and current day UFA's marketing of the Weimar cinema legacy, but I may have ended up squarely in the middle of what I was originally trying to move away from. Extra cinematic sites of exhibition and reception provide an optimal space for understanding the history of opposition and an oppositional element of the Kino-Öffentlichkeit, or cinematic public sphere. And it is true that the police arm of the state contributed in unrecognized ways up till now to the enduring legacy of Weimar cultural and socio-political modernity in facets that go beyond the traditional Weimar cinema canon. But it does remain to be seen whether this course of study that I'm undertaking accomplishes a decentering, a more inclusive recentering in the same center, or merely a recentering in a different spot. So I look forward to the discussion to have folks help me puzzle through this process of moving and how to avoid the gravitational pull of the institutions that produced the documents that are my corpus. Thank you.
All right, Sarah, I hear the applause roars in my ears. Thank you so much for the really interesting work. And I'm really excited to get in some discussion about police and film together, such contemporary relevance, and then also thinking about the issue of deterritorialization that you mentioned earlier with respect to decentering and how those things might be the same or need to be different. So we'll see where the conversation takes us in a bit. And I think some really wonderful points of connection with some of Sarah's discussions of maybe the need to rethink about deterritorialization rather than simply decentering. And I, just for the crowd, I don't mean that in a Deleuzian sense, and we can we can debate that as well. So our last panelist of this really excellent group of three is Evan Torner, who had his PhD completed at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and is now associate professor of German studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he directs the undergraduate program in German, as well as the UC Game Lab. So what a wonderful combination. His work examines the processes and ideologies of cultural production, with a primary focus on the popular media of German-speaking countries, especially the cinema of the former East Germany, as well as niche media of small press, tabletop role-playing games, RPG, and international live-action role-play, or LARP communities. So I'm very, very excited to hear Evan's presentation to kind of finish out this fantastic panel. Evan, the presentation has also a really wonderful title, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and Other Strangeness, the Transnational German Video Game Film Adaptation. Evan?
Thank you, Thomas. Let me share my screen with everybody. So let me see if that worked. There we go. And I just want to again thank Thomas, the other panelists, Sunka and Sara, as well as Nicole and Erwin, and the funders. And because it's a Saturday, that means my two small children are at home. So I'm especially thanking my partner Kat for wrangling them during this panel time. This is not easily one time where I can be away from my children on a weekend during a pandemic. So just as Sabina Hake talked about yesterday, I'm not using sort of philological or text immanent interpretations, and also just like our two panelists, I will be talking much more about structures and larger picture issues than the films themselves, but you can watch them as well. If we were to identify a center of German cinema studies, at least for North American German studies scholars, it would probably consist of aesthetically and politically significant German language titles from the Weimar silent era, Nazi era, some Hollywood exile films, the new German cinema in West Germany. Finally, we now have some canonical DEFA films from the East, the Berliner Schule, and then again, whatever Fatih Akin happens to be working on recently. These are cliches, of course, but it also reminds us of where our attention lies. And I actually think this is the right audience, this whole Decentering German Cinema Conference, for the other side of the picture. So if we're looking again at the periphery, not the center, then we're looking at, you know, Europe putting co-productions, openly derivative copies of other work that haven't had any critical acclaim, unlike what Sunka presented, queer love triangle films in Berlin Hinterhofe. And again, I have a shout out to Lola and Billy the Kid, right in the lower left here, as well as English language genre trash produced by Telepool München, shot in Canada, grainy pornography, orphan industrial cinema, and so forth. So I also have Klaus Lemke shouted out in this slide, who, you know, famously produces his genre film completely outside of the German funding structures and distribution structures. So especially if we are looking at political economy, that is the financial basis on which any film can be created or circulate, we should be mindful of the fact that the kind that we tend to analyze also has very specific financial roots. So today I'm going to talk about one of these peripheral areas of German film studies, namely the video game adaptation. And this came out small, but this is all of the major Hollywood video game adaptation releases, or 39 of them before the beginning of this year. And incidentally, Sonic the Hedgehog was the last film I got to see in a theater before COVID hit here. So that was that was a milestone in my own life. So of these 39 films, almost 40 films, the past three decades, curiously, over a third of the titles are German co-productions, and nearly all of these German co-productions were directed by these two men, Dr. Uwe Boll or British director Paul W.S. Anderson. They were both born in their respective European countries in 1965 and represent a specific Generation X filmmaker cohort that is able to, you know, reliably produce video game adaptation content. So all the major companies that deal in the video game films, except for, there's a notable exception, Studio Babelsberg helped with Doom in 2005, the Doom adaptation. But other than that, these are the three entities that are primarily involved, and they're all located in Bavaria, very interestingly enough. So again, one of the financial powerhouses of Germany. We have the late Bernd Eichinger's production company, Konstantin Film in Munich, already mentioned today. Rupert Murdoch-owned Telemünchen Gruppe, which has been renamed and recast in the recent years. And then Uwe Boll's own firm, Boll KG, which is located in Berg Rheinfeld. How Germany became the epicenter of video game production is largely a question of film financing and the ambitions of a few white German men in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But for German film studies, however, it's a useful history to recount, for it challenges our own impulse, as Randall Hawley notes, to retroactively nationalize film history and limiting its complexity. These are actually extremely complicated objects, these video game films. And if we're even using this word transnationalism in defining specific film relations, Mette Hjort would look at this as what we call opportunistic transnationalism. And I quote here her at length. Opportunistic transnationalism involves giving priority to economic issues to the point where monetary factors actually dictate the selection of partners beyond national borders. Opportunistic transnationalism is all about responding to available economic opportunities at a given moment in time, and in no wise about the creation of lasting networks or about the fostering of social bonds that are deemed to be inherently valuable. Now, in both of the cases that I'm going to be talking about today, these bonds did stick, the business models did stick, but they were born from sheer, monetary profit mindedness, right? So keep that in mind. So over the past 20 years, the video game film, which is again a cynical transnational commercial product by anyone's reckoning, has also become a staple of the annual German film catalog, a reliable entity that employs German film talent as well as shell companies, and recruits at least private corporate budgets girded with German tax dollars. So if German taxpayers do care about the outcome of their money, they are perhaps interested in the fact that it does line the pockets of many corporations. No stranger, of course, to what we do in the United States. Here I'm performing an act of denormalization or estrangement of what would otherwise be a pretty standard Hollywood Europe transaction, which is the mercenary financing of films, overwhelmingly by white men just talking to each other in rooms. There comes to a point where we can ask ourselves not only what is German about these English language films, but also the reverse. What do these genre films say about German cultural investments in the film industry? And there has to be some sort of national stake or national meeting in creating tax shelters and subsidies for films, otherwise rebroadcast as these products late at night on the channel Tele 5. So again, we have to ask our question, what is a German film anyway? Is it backed by German investors or the state? Is it German language? Does it have a German director and or crew? Does it deal with German content and form somehow? And here I'm going to just well, let's see, show anyway. Here we go. So in the big black box in the corner would have been Mariana Mazzucato's The Entrepreneurial State, which is actually the most important text guiding my research, where effectively it debunks the idea that there is even a private market that exists outside the behest of the state. But of course, Randall Holly, Thomas Piketty's Capital, in which he discusses the nature of wealth and its sort of stickiness over generations, and 100 Years of Studio Babelsberg, which is a book I translated, but also has a useful panoptic view of German film history from its origins to the present. So I want to talk a bit from that perspective about film financing in Germany, which is, again, always at the intersection between national, institutional, and commercial priorities. So World War I caught off an already bustling private film trade with France. So France was the main export market of German cinema from Mester and Bioscope, etc. And that's all shut down during World War I and allowed for Universum Film AG or UFA to consolidate the industry. Quoting Klaus Kreimeier, UFA was an artificially created colossus born of capital, clever negotiation, and patriotic delusion, which had already swept away everything before it. Private firms and state agencies fell victim to it. End quote. UFA always held with it a host of contradictions. It was a national military created studio that nevertheless sought to create then artistic and commercially viable blockbusters and even films that might be critical of the political establishment. But UFA saw the rise of state oversight and financing within the German film industry, which would then vacillate a bit under the Erich Pommer-dominated era of the 1920s. We have many Weimar cinema scholars here who could discuss the nature of that. Of course, political subsidy of the film industry increased tremendously under the Nazi regime, which was very much consolidated, though private film production continued. And following World War II, and again, this was also discussed today, the American occupation dismantled much of the cinematic funding infrastructure in the West, whereas Soviet-backed DEFA studios in the East were able to rely on state-level funding from early on. Mariana Ivanova's research on the East, as well as Tim Bergfelder's work on the West, reveals a slew of transnational co-production arrangements throughout the 1950s and 60s. And in the case of the former in the East, as Ivanova shows, commercial concerns could have never been bracketed out of socialist cinema. So there was never a point where the socialists were simply eyeing only socialist concerns and just circulating the money within the Eastern Bloc. Always there was an external market and other profits abroad in mind. In the case of the latter, which would be the West. You had, of course, a lot of commercial cinema, Heimatfilme, et cetera, in the 1950s and then early 60s, but then that would become considered Papa's Kino by the generation of the Oberhausen Manifesto, which would accuse this commercial cinema of retrograde Nazi and uncritical assumptions. So the 1950s and early 60s actually were rife with these transnational arrangements for West Germany because there wasn't ready state subsidy. However, by 1965, we had the Kuratorium Junger Deutscher Film, which which then allowed state-funded film financing to intervene. And Alexander Kluge's Abschied von Gestern was the first film funded in this fashion. By the time the law was developed in 1967, the Filmförderungsgesetz, that it was again set out to formally promote not only young filmmakers with experimental ideas, but also to promote the German film industry overall. And it did jumpstart the careers of people we know: Wim Wenders, Werner Herzog, Werner Fassbinder, Harun Farocki. But as Jan Dawson writes in her posthumous essay, A Labyrinth of Subsidies, which I definitely recommend to anyone who wants the contentious history of the new German cinema subsidy picture, it meant that most filmmakers would become dependent on film juries, especially between their first and their second feature. It was always easy to get money for a first feature, almost impossible to get a second feature. And that was mirrored in the East as well. East Germany had a problem with first-time directors and how to then get them to their second feature unless you really towed the line in a particular fashion. And the end effect was to drive actually most of the young filmmakers to working in television, because Filmförderung was quite unstable, whereas older filmmakers such as Kurt Hoffmann still benefited from generous subsidies for Papa's Kino. So you have Hellige Zeiten im Spessart in 1967, which is a pretty trashy third entry in the Spessart cycle with some time travel. But most notably, it had a scandal in which 3 million West German marks were received from the government directly to subsidize the film, that then neither would turn a profit nor was particularly artistically or visually or narratively significant. So again, a lot of subsidies would lead to dead-end films that no one would want. So the subsidies again in the 70s turned into what we would consider to be regional funding, and the 1979 is really when regional film subsidy bodies take over, and a lot of this was discussed in Sunka's talk. So what I'm going to concentrate really is the 1998 to 2005 era of the Medienfonds, because that era now we can really periodize thanks to the advent of quality television by 2015, which Sunka also discussed. That literally meant the reduction of overall federal film support in favor of a small number of high quality, internationally streamable television projects. But the Medienfonds picture is something I'd really like to discuss. And that, of course, requires me to discuss how tax shelters work. So tax shelters in end effect are agreed upon investments that do not count as taxable income. So you dump your money in it and then you get your tax reimbursement effectively immediately. You do it in order to incentivize investment in certain areas such as property or retirement plans or municipal bonds, those which in theory build society. With Germany reconceiving itself as a Filmstaat in the middle of the EU and creating tax shelters with the Medienfonds, it turns out that would create an environment in which you could create a film like Lola Rent, Run Lola Run for Ex-Filme Verleih, but also almost immediately in 1998, they were hijacked by Hollywood. And the most famous example, which is also instrumental for our discussion of video game films, is, of course, Lara Croft Tomb Raider from 2001, which is a German, British, US, Japanese co-production. And again, you have to think, how is this Hollywood film in any way German? Well, without Germany's so-called stupid German money, and that's what the Hollywood lawyers would call it, because it was so well subsidized, this film couldn't have existed. And also lots of memorable films from that era, K-Pax, Mission Impossible 2, those all benefited tremendously from German taxpayers paying for other rich people's money to be protected, more or less, through this through these tax shelters. So what are we talking about? Well, Lara Croft Tomb Raider was one of the greatest film financing schemes of the early 2000s. Telemünchengruppe created a tax shelter that allowed those who were investing to immediately deduct their contributions without the company that they were even creating requiring some sort of local or crew vocational investment. So there wasn't any milieu building transnationalism here. This was purely Germans would create a company. Then Paramount sold the Tomb Raider rights to the German shell firm created by Telemünchengruppe for $94 million, and then and then of course would buy it back from the German shell firm for $83.8 million, which was all legal because of the way these were set up, and gave then $10 million to basically hand to Angelina Jolie and the major stars. It got them their cast for almost nothing. There was then another sale that allowed them to make another $12 million dealing with Lombard Bank in the UK, and that'll qualify them for Section 48 tax breaks because they were using some British actors, and Lara Croft, as you know, is British, so it allowed them to rely on the British subsidy system as well. And then back in the day, there was something called pre-sales equity, which is more or less a collapsed system, but certain countries could buy into your film, or companies in those countries could buy into your film to help you finish it, knowing that it would do well domestically with their audiences. And this was pre-sales to Japan, UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Why? Video games were a popular commodity for young people, and that was about it. The actual video game content was secondary to the fact that they knew it would work for a particular demographic. And of course, then you would get Lara Croft Tomb Raider in 2001, Resident Evil followed in 2002, and also brought out Blood Rain in 2005, and you can see they all have the pattern of the martial woman who is ready to fight and of course also is a playable video game character that has been adapted to cinema. Lara Croft Tomb Raider in sort of social justice circles is seen as one of the first woman-led action films, of which we would see more and more of throughout the 2000s. But of course, all of that budgetarily was accomplished thanks to the German taxpayer contributions. So this model then gets picked up. Telemünchengruppe does it for Lara Croft, and so Konstantin immediately takes a script that it had sort of optioned in the late 90s. It had optioned Resident Evil in the late 90s, and Paul W.S. Anderson, who had directed a video game film, Mortal Kombat, in the mid 90s, pitched a script to Konstantin Film, Bernd Eichinger, who is there very, very influential, greenlit it, and because a lot of the let's say locations were so familiar to Bernd Eichinger, they wound up shooting most of Resident Evil in Germany, and of course it made a lot of money. It's seen as sort of an anti-corporate zombie film franchise. Didn't have very favorable reviews, but that didn't stop fans from going, and they made 6 movies ultimately in this cycle. Now Uwe Boll, originally was a radio film reviewer, and got into filmmaking, in Munich in the early 90s, at the time when, again, film funding was not well available. He wound up going back into academia, writing about TV series, and then went back into filmmaking because of the Medienfonds. So you can say, yes, the Medienfonds did encourage German filmmaking, but probably filmmaking of the worst kind. The reason why, Boll really didn't care about video games. What he did care about actually was that video games were such cheap rights and were easily able to pass through the Medienfonds system as movies that would potentially make a profit for the tax shelters. So he solicited a group of German dentists, about 200 of them, to then exploit the tax shelter loophole. took his own small German production crew and shot in Vancouver, British Columbia, for additional tax subsidies, paid all of the Hollywood actors in euros, which they liked a lot, as a nice currency and right up front cash. Of course, this cash was available thanks to German taxpayers. They would have an unprofitable film release, and then would we go on to have DVD sales, right? So I'm gonna to cycle again towards the end here a little bit, but Uwe Boll is able to get through a number of these video game films just based off of this particular model. So to wrap things up today, again, we're thinking about these are some German locations that we could have talked about, but what I want to say is that the transnational video game adaptations highlight several perhaps uncomfortable aspects of German cinema. One is the outsized role of film finance, specifically German state level investment in their existence, and oftentimes these subsidies go in directions that do not promote quality filmmaking. They promote the kind of filmmaking that most likely would get the subsidy. They remind us that when media products are sought that reasonably then earn back their budget in English-speaking market, a very competitive one, global video games with fans with disposable income, who are often seen as young, white, and male, become this unabashed target demographic. And in this way, cinema just becomes piles of money circulating between audiences and countries. Very interesting piles of money, but ultimately it's kind of reductionist. And at the same time, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, highlights how much the back-end finance and subsidy grooming, in which loopholes of a given global system can just be exploited by various actors, plays a role here too. These films are financial instruments in addition to aesthetic products. They're used to evade taxes. They're used to prop up global media portfolios across diverse audiences and platforms. And furthermore, that German audiences shouldn't be bracketed out of the equation, as Randall Hawley notes that these individual consumers of the video game films are agentic, rational beings who are also taking in this sort of global geek culture in their own local and specific context. So Germans also watch these films, but not at the exclusion of other audiences worldwide. To dismiss the whole phenomenon then is to dismiss both consumers and producers alike, as well as the actual working machinery of the state, as these films nevertheless come into being and are watched. So modern German film production proves unintelligible unless we understand the complex configuration of subsidies, finance capital, transmedial franchises, staffing networks, and transnational inequalities behind it. Or put more simply, if Germany is moving around large piles of money through cinema, shouldn't we in German film studies follow the money and see where it leads us? Thank you.
Evan, thank you so much. Follow the money is right. It sounds like a good political campaign as well. So with that, I want to make sure I turn the floor over to the audience, with questions for this group. There's a Q&A box that's open. I'll kind of monitor that. I have some thoughts about how to engage and start our conversations, but I know our time is rather limited. We have about 8 or 9 minutes left for questions. So I'll ask everyone in the audience to just post your questions, to the Q&A box, and then our panelists can have them, even if we don't get to them during our discussion right now. And that will be a wonderful way to sort of make sure that the conversation can continue, certainly into the next panel after our break and beyond. So the first question is from Philip Cabian. It says, Philip says, hi, thank you so much for organizing this virtual conference. My question is for Sara. She mentioned that the police, for example, expressed strong aesthetic and formal preferences that were familiar from studio films. How were these articulated? And were they understood as German in any way, or did they point to broader international aesthetics? Did you catch that, Sara? Did I say that?
I did. Thank you. Yep,
Okay.
got it. So thanks for the question, Phil, and good to see you here. So it's a mixed bag. The films that were more oriented towards instruction and training were turning more to German traditions of instructional training and scientific films. So while there may be models outside of Germany, they weren't necessarily looking to them. So when you look at the programming records, for example, pulling films into these exhibitions, they're turning mostly to German entities, police agencies or studios around Germany. But when it came to the 1926 police exhibition, which was a huge showcase event, there was more thinking about creating a blockbuster German police film, and under the auspices, though, of the Kulturfilm Abteilung. So it wasn't a blockbuster that was going to be made and marketed in the same channels as Faust or Nibelungen or Metropolis, even though it was the same studio. It was under the roof of the Kulturfilm Abteilung. But the films that they looked to for a model for that, there's one in particular called Into the Net, which was in German, it was called Mädchenhändler von New York. And that was the most attended film, highest ticket sales in Germany in 1926. And that actually had input from the chief of the New York police, Enright was his name. So you see kind of two different sorts of energies going on in terms of production, collaboration, and aesthetic models. So thanks.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much. I have another question here, and this is from Kalani, a fellow Golden Gopher alum from University of Minnesota, as am I. What a fantastic panel. My question is for Sunka, whose presentation was very rich. Lots of questions, but just trying to ask one here. The final remarks on new German cinema and a kind of new German cinema on Netflix are very thought-provoking. I'm wondering if you could comment a bit more on the disconnect between German and international audiences read German Netflix. This seems to be a difference between classic new German cinema and German cinema on Netflix. Many German shows on Netflix, as you mentioned, are more popular abroad than in Germany. Can you say more on the export category of German, quote unquote, German Netflix? Are they, in terms of subject matter, similar to previous German film exports, comparable to the kind of Netflix export categories from other countries like France or Italy and other places? So a really rich question there for Sunku, a really rich presentation. So.
Thank you, Kalani. Thanks everyone. Also, Evan, awesome. Thank you. I'm so glad we dovetailed so well. And I do think that Babylon Berlin could also be the new Polizei, show, Polizeifilm, sort of Kulturfilm, all of that stuff that Sarah said. So thanks for putting us together. Very rich. So I would start kind of this question this way, and that is, yes, there is a disconnect right now. First of all, because of the differences in library and archive holdings and rights, licensing rights and so forth. What German Netflix Germany offers is not the same as what US Netflix offers. That again is something that I think is going to be changing at some point, specifically because people weren't even looking for German television shows on Netflix. And that is because of this reverse flow. It's slowly dawning on people that they can actually watch domestic content, television content on Netflix and Amazon, let's say. Amazon has a few shows as well. So that would be one thing that I would say. And that's also this discoverability, for example, of Dark varies very much from the discoverability, let's say, of Babylon Berlin, because again, it has a different flow. There is a different flow to it between the domestic global sort of, dissemination practices and findability, accessibility. Then the other thing is, and that's really the topic of my book, where I'm really going to diving much deeper into the subject, which I couldn't do for this talk, is really about what remains of the German, what export category is this? And this gets even more fascinating when I have students, and I did Dark in my intermediate German class this semester, and they're like, it's not German enough. And I'm like, what the hell do you mean? And so we had this incredible, so there is this, these assumptions, these stereotypical, national labels that are attached to these things that for this generation Z don't come from the tradition necessarily, they come from other things. So it is definitely something that I'm wrestling with and really intrigued about, and how that gets reinforced from the outside when the inside is ready to decenter. So in any case, it's really intriguing. But yeah, so there are other nations, and this is really intriguing, specifically as far as the genre conventions go. There are genre conventions like the telenovela that have sort of made that sort of made that jumped over the abyss, let's say, to the digital divide, made it really, really well. And but they also show, if you want, sort of the televisual history of these countries and their overwhelming domestic sort of categories or for what they're known. And for Germany, that's clearly the crime drama. The crime drama is, and the hybridity with which it experiments, also in German, on German network television, let's say Tatort Reiniger versus, something like, what's the show with this one woman, detective in this rural area? I always forget what it's called. Anyway, so you have a bunch of variety there, and dark is one of those. So I would say, yes, there are something you could say, there are things that are sort of attaching themselves to that sort of convergence moment and riding along as the national. But that, again, I would hesitate to say that it's pure continuity. There is always continuity mixed in with change and innovation. So anyway, thank you. Fabulous questions. Lots to think about.
And I know we don't have very much time, but I did want to maybe just circle back to Evan. And Evan, I really found your talk about just the financing dimension of film production in general and the relationship to video game culture of particular interest, given my location in the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland. And I'm curious, the thought occurred to me when Sunka was presenting, but I think also your paper might speak to this in terms of how the marketing loop happens, how the idea to fund certain kinds of franchises, certain kinds of films internationally come from a kind of feedback loop. And I was thinking about algorithms in particular with respect to Sunka's presentation about this, and she mentioned the word discoverability. One of the things that Netflix does so well and other streaming providers are, oh, if you like Stranger Things, you should try this film Dark or this series Dark. So Evan, I'm just wondering if you can say very briefly and as fast as you feel comfortable, how do algorithms factor into the production apparatus you've described now with respect to international funding?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The era I'm talking about, specifically the late 90s and early 2000s, is the booming time of DVD, right? This is even before Blu-ray enters, and now we can periodize DVD, which is where Netflix built its empire, but also these German films were supposed to have a certain type of transnational camouflage. As long as they have Hollywood actors on the cover, then they would sell seamlessly within the market, and it didn't matter where they came from, which was part of the shtick. They were made for the poster and for the DVD cover, so that some kid in Thailand would say, "Oh, cool, a Hollywood film," and it wouldn't matter, right? Even though these are German Canadian Hollywood actor productions with complex subsidy systems that may also bring us back to German television. They may also be streamed on German television with those rights. So camouflage was of the utmost importance in the DVD era. And I'll also say that In the Name of the King, Uwe Boll's Dungeon Siege tale adaptation, absolutely terrible. But if you want a good laugh of like an uncanny Lord of the Rings ripoff, there you go. And Lord of the Rings also survived off of German tax shelters, right? So the In the Name of the King was one of the core components of early Netflix streaming. It was there as one of the early films, if you wanted to just turn on a fantasy film. But it was very popular there, right? It would always have 4 or 5 stars, whereas the critics, panned it obviously and didn't do very well in the box office. But they lived this weird second life for at least 4 or 5 years on Netflix. So, I think the camouflage aspect is very important for my corpus, but not for the corpus that Sunka is talking about, where there is a, definitive, like a transnational German Qualitätsfernsehen that is being marketed there. So that's my answer.
It is a really wonderful response, Evan. I think we've gotten, just from the 3 panelists in general, this collective, some really great ways to think about decentering German cinema, deterrorizing, but also these terms, discoverability and then camouflage, and the way in which you both have used them, Evan and Sunka, to kind of maybe talk about a particular more recent period in German cinema, thinking back to the archival connections in some of Sara's work. So really just want to say thank you to the 3 of you for fantastic presentations. I'll enjoy other comments and questions and look forward to those. I think folks can probably add those into the Q&A section, and they'll get shared out by Evan and Irvin and Nicole, who are working behind the scenes, as it were. But we have a little bit of a bio break, as we like to say in the Bay Area, so you can, go to the bathroom and get some refreshments. Not at, in the next 15 minutes or so. So we'll reconvene here at 15 minutes after the hour, and that's about 12 or 13 minutes. So I look forward to seeing you all back here, and just thank you again, Sara, Sunka, and Evan. Thank you.